All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Kate Fitzgerald, and I am the Distance Learning Specialist at the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we are here to talk today about Robert Edsel's new book, The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History. But I'm going to quickly do a couple of webinar housekeeping things and talk about some question and answers before we get started. So on your screen, you should see something that says Participation Technology Review. At the bottom of your screen, you see a button that says Q&A. So this is for if you have questions while the presentation is going on, for myself, for Robert. We also have a special guest. One of our museum curators is here with us. Also, if you're having any technological problems, we might be able to help you out. So you might be able to write that in there, and we have somebody watching the Q&A. And so again, please type your questions in there, and at the end, we will get to as many as possible. And so without further ado, because we're not here to talk about technology, we are here to talk about the new book, The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History. And so it is a true story of how American and British volunteers found themselves in a desperate race against time to locate and save many priceless treasures. You know, when we learn about history, sometimes we don't think about all the other parts about history, right? And how art plays such a big role in history, and especially World War II. So Robert is here with us today to talk about his new book. And I also wanted to remind everyone, if you do not have the book with you or you haven't read it yet, we are offering a 20% discount in our museum store online. At checkout, just use the code webinar. And I'll put this information in our follow-up email as well. But if you have the book with you today, I'm actually going to read a couple of passages, so make sure you have it with you. But I'm going to let Robert take over now, and he is going to tell us about the book. So Robert, feel free to share your screen and go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really excited that everybody can be here, and it's a remarkable story, and I look forward to having a chance to tell you more about who these remarkable heroes were, the monuments, men and women. And this is the front cover of the book. It's the fourth book I've written, but it's the first one I've written specifically for you, for this audience, to be able to tell the entire story in one book. And it really begins with this aspiring student, Adolf Hitler, as a teenager, wanting to be recognized as a great artist and architect, but he's rejected from the Vienna Academy of Arts as a student. And he believes that he has been discriminated against by jurors who he accused of being Jews. And this fueled this hatred that he had as he rose to power in Nazi Germany. And art became a weapon of propaganda on his first state visit to Florence, Italy. In 1938, you can see the bridges in Florence in the background. Hitler only had 10 hours in Florence, but he spent 2 hours walking through the museums in Florence, through the Pitti Palace and the Uffizi, feeling this sense of being an artist among artists. His failed ambitions not recognized, but he felt he had these great skills that had been overlooked. And as he walked through the halls of these great, great collections, the idea for creating a museum in his own hometown of Linz, Austria, a museum that would be called the Fuhrer Museum, the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Linz, originated. And he returned to Berlin and started making drawings of how the city was going to be rebuilt. And at the center of the city was going to be this new cultural complex centered and anchored by this great museum. As Hitler consolidated power, paintings were one of the preferred gifts among Nazi leaders. You see in this photo, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the police squad that was so instrumental in the creation of the Holocaust and the death camps, being handed to Hitler to recognize his birthday. And this was just one of thousands of events where works of art were traded among the Nazi leaders. In 1939, in September, the Nazi invasion of Poland set off alarm bells throughout museums in Europe. These photographs are from the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. Some 400,000 objects were evacuated in a period of 10 days, leaving the Grand Gallery of the Louvre completely empty. The great concern wasn't theft originally, it was what would happen to these works of art if the cities were bombed and fires started. Works like Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa were moved on 6 separate occasions, trying to keep them out of harm's way. The great sculpture Wings of Samothrace, which sits at the top of the stairwell in the Louvre, was lowered down on these wooden skids and crated and moved to countryside chateau outside the city of Paris. And this situation was repeated at cities throughout Europe. In Florence, Michelangelo's great sculpture of the David was entombed in brick by craftsmen, along with other sculptures of his in the foreground known as the Slaves, because of the concern that Allied bombing might damage the roof of the Accademia and cause the roof to collapse and destroy Michelangelo's great achievement. In Milan, local art officials were concerned about Leonardo da Vinci's great painting, the Last Supper, painted on this dining hall, the north wall. So they placed sandbags and wooden scaffolding held in place by these metal bars on both sides of the wall on the what-if chance that bombing might somehow cause vibration and place the painting at risk. And it was fortuitous because a British bomb landed in the center of the courtyard and obliterated the courtyard of the cloister of the dead, where the friars would walk each morning. It destroyed the east wall of the refectory, leaving the painting in the upper left-hand side behind this wooden scaffolding. And you can see how precarious it was, exposed to the elements, the sandbags protruding out the side. And this is how it would be for 2 years before local art officials could rebuild the roof and the wall of the refectory. The monuments men were a group of museum curators, architects, artists. Many of them were professors and teachers. Some were librarians who volunteered for service during World War II to try and protect some of the great cultural treasures of Western Europe from damage by Allied bombing. And then in the course of their work there, as the revelations about the Nazis' theft became known, they became art detectives engaged in what was the greatest treasure hunt in history, trying to track down millions of stolen works of art. A couple of the monuments officers who I profile in my new book, one is Dean Keller. Keller was a professor of art and also an artist, a 42-year-old man with a 3-year-old son, Dino, who left school, volunteered for military service, put on a uniform, and went into harm's way into Italy. He was had a lot of knowledge about Italy. He spoke Italian, and he was also a very committed father, trying to figure out how do you be a parent to a 3-year-old boy you've left behind who's some 5,000 miles away. And after writing letters and realizing his son couldn't read, he started sending him these drawings or cartoons, V-mails they were called. Long before email, there was V-mail. And this is a sketch he did of himself sewing on his Fifth Army patch onto his jacket the night he discovered that he was going to be the sole monuments officer for U.S. Fifth Army. He walked through or arrived in Pisa shortly after combat operations ended and performed some extraordinarily important work there. But like so many visitors to Pisa who take photographs, Dean Keller drew this photograph of him standing where it looks like he's holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa to send to his son and stay in touch with him. And these were just a couple of the dozens of drawings that we make reference to in the book and hundreds of drawings that he sent to his son. Another key monuments officer was Fred Hart, who was a great and developing art historian who had a great passion for Italy. And so Keller and Hart and a handful of other monuments officers arrive in Italy in the fall of 1943. They start in Naples and work their way up through Rome, through Siena, and arrive in Florence fearful of the damage that may have taken place in this jewel-like city. And they're stunned when they reached the outskirts of Florence and discovered that hundreds of works of art from the most important museums in Florence are lying in these villas outside the city, unprotected, without any crates or wrapping, and you can see them leaning up against the walls of this villa. They'd been moved there by the local art officials to try and get them out of the cities, and when the oncoming ground warfare placed them in jeopardy, the local art officials had no trucks to move them back into the city, so they were stuck in the battlefields as the artillery and explosions took place all around these buildings. And we speak not of minor works of art. This is Dean Keller standing next to Sandro Botticelli's extraordinary painting by Primavera, just one of the works that was left behind because of its size. They wouldn't fit into the truck. But hundreds of other works were taken by the Nazi soldiers up to northern part of Italy on their way into Germany. And it was a theft of epic proportions that set the monuments officers in Italy on this journey trying to find clues to where the works of art had been taken. When they arrived in Florence, these scenes of destruction greeted them. All of the bridges, with the exception of one, destroyed by Nazi forces as they fled the city, trying to slow down the Allied advance. All the images in black are areas that were just obliterated. Some of the rubble piles reached 30 feet high. Both sides of the river were impassable, and it destroyed so much of the ancient city, the medieval portions of the city with its great towers and history. And this is a photograph taken atop one of the buildings, and you get a sense of the degree of destruction. None of the buildings have even a shard of glass left in them. Just extraordinary devastation to this great, great Renaissance city. In Northern Europe, as General Eisenhower and his forces moved from Italy to England to prepare for the Normandy landings in June 1944, they took with them all the experiences of Italy, and some, of course, were mistakes that were made. General Eisenhower had issued an historic order in December 1943 in Italy, shortly before leaving, saying that it was a responsibility not just of his commanders, but all troops to respect cultural treasures as much as war allowed. He went on to say, if it came down to the lives of his men or an object, obviously the lives of his men counted more. But he noticed that too often times that was used as an excuse of convenience, and he pointed out to the troops that it was important to not only win the war, but try and avoid devastation to what is our shared cultural heritage. This order was only issued about 6 months after the troops had arrived in Italy, but in Northern Europe, in preparation for the Normandy landings, General Eisenhower issued it 2 weeks before the embarkment of this extraordinary crusade into Europe. The key monuments officers in Northern Europe were George Stout, and Stout was one of the older monuments men. He was 46. He'd actually fought in World War I, and he was a conservator of works of art at the Fogg Museum in Harvard. Stout was the one who had the idea to create monuments men. He was convinced there was going to be a Second World War. He'd studied the impact of the new technologies and warfare on works of art, and had developed pamphlets about how to go about protecting these works of art during combat. He was assisted by Jim Rorimer, who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum's Cloisters Museum just outside New York City. Rorimer was fluent in French, and he loved all things French and was an enormous asset to the monuments men. And Walker Hancock, who was one of the United States' great sculptors, who also volunteered for service. None of these men were likely to be drafted because of their age, but they all felt they had a contribution to make. Many of them had been educated in Europe between the two wars, and they knew of these important works of art and wanted to do something to try and contribute to the war effort. As they landed in France and worked their way to Paris, they arrived at this important small museum near the Louvre Museum called the Jeu de Paume. And inside this museum, the Nazis had commandeered it, in particular, the number 2 man in the Nazi party, Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. And Goering had made 22 separate visits to this museum during the war. You see him sitting there on the lower left side, holding a painting in his hand. He's got a cigar in his right hand. There's a bottle of champagne on the table. And this was the headquarters for the Nazi looting operation in France. Tens of thousands of works of art stolen from collectors and important dealers, many of whom were Jews, were brought to the museum. And we speak not just of paintings, but also sculpture, drawings, tapestries, furniture, art objects, including these two great paintings by Henri Matisse. And they were presented to Goering for him to decide which works of art he wanted to have for his own collection, which works of art were going to go to Adolf Hitler's collection, and then the others that were loaded onto trains and taken back to Germany. So this was a premeditated theft. They knew where these great works of art were. Many of them were traded for other works of art, but it was an extensive looting operation unlike anything we've ever seen. One of the great heroines of the story, and a woman I loved sharing her story about in my book, is a woman named Rose Vallon. Rose was a custodian of the museum in the United States. We would call her a curator, responsible for the Jeu de Paume Museum. And for 4 years, she worked in this museum and without the Germans' knowledge, understood German and listened to their conversations and made secret notes about what she heard. She had practically a photographic memory, and she recognized so many of these works of art that came to the museum, and she was a spy for the museum director in France, reporting which works had been stolen, where they'd been taken in Germany. And this information which she gathered was essential to the work of the monuments men as they spread further and further into France and on their way into Germany, looking for where these works of art had been taken. As the combat operations took them through France, into Belgium, into Holland, and finally crossing the border into Germany, they started making extraordinary discoveries, including this discovery at a salt mine in a German town of Merkers. Two of the monuments officers were killed in combat. Ronald Balfour, a British monuments officer, and Walter Hutchhausen, an American from Perry, Oklahoma. Both were killed in March and April, respectively, 1945, as they pursued leads about works of art that were missing.
In central Germany, troops of the Third Army uncovered Germany's gold reserve hidden in a salt mine. Gold and foreign currencies worth millions. And art treasures from German museums, stored here for safekeeping. Rembrandts, Raphaels, Leonardos, and a Renoir. It is not yet decided what shall be done with them.
So inside this salt mine, the monuments men and American soldiers had found, in today's equivalent, some $10 billion of gold. Gold coins, gold bars, and it was an extraordinary discovery, essentially like tripping over our Fort Knox in the United States. Also, they found thousands and thousands of works of art that had in fact not been stolen. They were from the great museums in Berlin that had been evacuated to get them out of the destruction in the city and try and save them. And you can see in this photograph Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley standing there flipping through these paintings, amazed to see them in this salt mine some almost 3,000 feet below the surface of the earth. But they also made horrific discoveries. There were some 200 suitcases stuffed full of gold fillings taken from concentration camp victims, jewelry, silver objects, watches, and General Eisenhower can be seen standing here looking at one of these open suitcases, disgusted, knowing that the people that once owned these important personal relics had perished in concentration camps. The next discovery occurred at a castle in Neuschwanstein.
Housed a great part of the art treasures stolen by the Nazis. Taken from royal families, the Rothschilds, and private French collectors, many of the 23,000 pieces were never unpacked. Not content with robbing people of their freedom and their lives, the Nazis tried to make off with their symbols of culture.
So at this castle, known for being the model for Disneyland, this fairy tale castle, the Germans had hidden some 23,000 works of art stolen from France. And Rose Valland, you see her now in a military uniform, left her position as a custodian once Paris was liberated and joined up in the French army. She was made a captain, and she went to Germany at her first opportunity with these extraordinary collections of lists of the works of art, and she provided them to a man who'd become her friend, Jim Rorimer. And Rorimer, seen there on the left, holding one of these Renaissance pieces of jewelry that had belonged to a French collecting family known as the Rothschilds, an important Jewish family. And these were some of the 23,000 objects that Rorimer was able to successfully find and protect that had been stolen from France. And he knew to go to this castle because of Rose Valland's heroism in gathering this information at the risk of her life over 4 years. And you see this photograph of Rorimer standing on the steps with soldiers walking out of the castle with 3 paintings, just some of the 23,000 objects that were found there. In northern Italy, Dean Keller and Fred Hart finally received clues about where the works of art stolen from Florence and its museums had been taken. And inside this jail cell, packed inside this very small space, were paintings by Rubens, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Botticelli, Caravaggio, some of the great, great artists of history that had been stolen by the Nazis. You see this photograph that was taken of the German soldiers when they had arrived with the stolen works of art on the back of the trucks with no more protection than this straw and in open top trucks. And in fact, it was misting on the day that these paintings arrived in the fall of 1944. And the works of art that they found were extraordinary. This painting by Botticelli, this Annunciation, the sculpture by Michelangelo, Bacchus, Donatello, one of the great sculptures, the sculpture of St. George. And by the early part of May 1945, Adolf Hitler now has committed suicide, but the monuments officers are frustrated because despite all of the success of discoveries they've made in hundreds of salt mines and caves and castles, the works of art that were destined for Adolf Hitler's private collection and the museum in Linz continued to elude their grasp. And it was the focus of 2 monuments officers, Robert Posey, an architect from Alabama, and Lincoln Kirstein, a cultural impresario and co-founder of the New York City Ballet from New York, who finally received a critical tip from a German dentist that led them to a salt mine outside Salzburg, Austria, in a small lake town called Altarpiece. And this was a photograph Robert Posey took himself. And you see the immediacy of it with these shovels and picks in the foreground. And they've literally burrowed their way up over the top of this rubble, fearful that their worst nightmares have been realized, that the Germans have destroyed the works of art, trying to keep them from the Allied victors. And what they would later learn is that the miners, and you see one of the miners up there on the left with the flashlight, in an effort to try and protect their way of living, destroyed the passageways of the mine to try and keep the Germans from getting into the mines to detonate the explosives that they placed there. So Posey and Kirstein scurry over the top of this on their bellies and are stunned to see areas that have been hollowed out in this mine, some 2 stories in height. You see that ladder there in the center of the photograph that's about 10 feet tall. So you get a sense of how big the spaces are. They've placed boards on the floor of the stone mine. These mines I've been in, they're very cold. Average temperature year-round is about 42 or 43 degrees. You see thousands of paintings that have been placed in these wooden racks that they constructed. And they're some of the most important paintings in the world. The Ghent Altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, painted in 1432, that is today in Ghent, Belgium. This is a painting that's about 20 feet in width and about 15 feet in height, that a monuments man, George Stout, standing there in the center with the N on his jersey, is dealing with just the central panel of the Ghent Altarpiece. And you see other portions of the works of art sitting on milk cartons over his shoulder, leaning up against the wall of the salt mine behind him. There are about 35 recognized paintings by Johannes Vermeer in the world. Adolf Hitler stole 2 of them, one the artist's studio, which the monuments officers are holding here, and the other, which is on the back cover of my new book, The Astronomer, which was the very first work Adolf Hitler targeted for theft in Paris, owned by the Rothschilds. The monuments officers also found the only sculpture by Michelangelo that left Italy during his lifetime, the Bruges Madonna, which is a sculpture of extraordinary beauty, found by George Stout, lying on its side inside the salt mine, still wrapped in the burlap mattress that the Nazis brought when they stole it in the dead of night in September 1944. The thefts of the Nazis, though, vastly exceeded just paintings. It had included millions of important books from thousands of Europe's most important libraries. This is a warehouse containing some of the millions of books that the monuments officers would spend years sorting through, trying to determine what libraries they'd been stolen from so they could be returned. These are thousands of church bells stolen from churches throughout France and Belgium that the monuments officers found on a shipyard in Bremen that were preparing to be smelted and converted into war materials by the German war machine. These were lucky survivors. There were thousands of church bells that had already been melted down and converted into military use. The monuments officers, again, spent years looking at the foundry marks on each of these bells, trying to determine which church they belonged to as they began this laborious process of returns that went on for years after the war. In this photograph of an American rabbi chaplain standing on a pile of Torah scrolls some 10 feet high that had been protected, ironically, by the Nazis. They intended to create museums to show how, in their view, Jews, gays, Slavs, and others were subhuman. And so while they destroyed and murdered millions of people and destroyed so much of their cities and cultures, they preserved these important religious objects as a way of putting them on display. And ironically, paradoxically, they survived the war. You see Rabbi Chaplain Sam Bender going through, holding these precious objects, trying to determine what synagogue or what country they might have come from. The monuments officers stayed in Europe until 1951, and by the time they returned, they had returned some 5 million objects to the countries from which they'd been stolen, including 1 million objects that belonged to German museums that they were the custodians of during the time that the German museums had to be rebuilt. One of the most famous works of art that they returned was this great portrait by Leonardo da Vinci, Lady with an Ermine, that was stolen from Krakow, Poland, and it is now back in Poland today. You see monuments officers standing there around this painting outside of a train, just a photo op that they decided, let's take a photograph and see what we've got. And you see that they've gotten a hammer on the right side of the photograph and a screwdriver down in the bottom, and have quickly taken off the lid and the paper on top of it to pull this wooden panel out and take a photograph of what it looked like. So this is a quick overview of an extraordinary story, the greatest theft in history, which led to the greatest treasure hunt in history. And it's been a remarkable privilege of mine to be able to tell this story and to be able to share it with you today. And I look forward to answering any questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Robert. And we are going to get to questions in just a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper and talk about some themes that I found in the book when reading it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And the first theme I'm going to talk about are letters during wartime. And so if you have the book in front of you, if you'll turn to chapter 10, page 141, it said, "Today is Christmas, and my first thoughts are with you and Dean. As I write, the roar of tanks and heavy vehicles is in the air. Some boys will eat a turkey leg in a pup tent or in a foxhole. Some will die this day. Downstairs, the radio has come on and someone is singing a carol. This is my Christmas, a big one filled with the highest ideals a man is capable of." And so this was a letter written by Captain Dean Keller from New Haven, Connecticut, as you just learned, to his wife and his young son. And he wrote it on something that is super, super interesting that I didn't actually know about until pretty recently, and that was Victory Mail, or V-mail. And basically, during World War II, the Allies, to save valuable room on cargo ships, would use V-mail. And it started in England, and it was a process that involved microfilming special letter sheets. And so instead of taking up cargo space full of letters, you would put them on microfilm, and when they got overseas, then they would put it on the letter. And so you saw basically a template that you could write to someone overseas, or someone overseas could write at home. And the Monuments Men use these a lot. And we can see here, these two are not from the Monuments Men, but these are two examples, one from a guy named Frank, actually. And some of them, think of like postcards, they were templates. And so he sent this from his overseas position during World War II. And it basically said, "Happy birthday" to his wife. And it was on a microfilm, and when it got back to the States, it was blown up and sent home to her. And letters play a really big role, not only in World War II in terms of keeping up the morale, both at home and overseas, but also in studying World War II. I mean, think about how much we have been able to learn about the Monuments Men and what they did from their letters. And so if you don't have this book yet, you'll see once you read it, a lot of the letters and the pictures of the letters are in here, and they really help you understand what they were going through and what they were trying to achieve. And the other, and this one I found really interesting, theme is, of course, women in service to country. So we're going to jump to chapter 12 now on page 165. There have been several close calls, but only one in February 1944 did the Nazi lackeys catch her red-handed trying to read addresses on shipping documents. Bruno Lohse, Goering's art buyer, confronted Vaillant, warning that she could be shot for such indiscretions. But she sloughed it off, telling him, "No one here is stupid enough to ignore the risk before walking away." Luck had favored her that day, but with the Allied landing at Normandy, threats became more frequent and menacing. And so Rose Valland is the only really female of the Monuments Men, and she was a French heroine. She worked, as you heard, in that Chaudière Museum wasn't allowed to have the term curator yet. She doesn't get that till later on in life, but she secretly maintained, right? And if she had been caught, her life was in danger, records of countless looted artworks so that they could be recovered after the war. And it's really due to her bravery and these recordings. She spoke German, although the Germans did not know that, that we recovered, a lot of artwork. And so that brings me to American women in World War II. So they were called upon in many previous ways that were only reserved for men. Over 6 million wartime jobs in factories were held by women. Right here in New Orleans, Louisiana, we had the Higgins Industries that made the Higgins Boats, the boats used on D-Day, over 92% of them built right here in New Orleans. Many of those boats were built by women. Women's auxiliary branches of everything from the Marine Corps to the Navy were created, and it really opened many, many doors for women, not only in jobs, but also in the military. And so women all over the world, here in America, but also, as you can see from Rose Valland in France, played a huge role in World War II. And so those are, when I was reading, the two things that really stuck out to me. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce her first, our Assistant Director for Curatorial Services on. Her name is Kim, and she is going to talk to us a little bit about our monuments collection, kind of what it's like to be a museum curator, and kind of how we care for these things, and what we're going to do with our monuments collection. And so the first picture that you're going to see on your screen, I'm going to let Kim take it over and tell us about what you're looking at.
Sure. So that's not me, I'll just say to start. So that's my colleague, Tony Kaiser, who is Assistant Director for Collection Management. So in her role, she's standing in our newly renovated vault space. So similar to the salt mine, no. It is a space that's designed to house and preserve artifacts. So in this photograph, you can see part of our collection of uniforms. So that's just a small part, small portion of the number of objects that the museum houses. So we have roughly 250,000 objects in the collection, as well as around 150,000 documents. So we have a vast collection, and we've expanded space recently where we can care for and preserve the artifacts. So in that photo, you see Tony. She's wearing purple gloves. That's to protect the artifacts from handling. And I have those on as well right now. But Tony is looking at all of the jackets that you'll notice they all have tags on them. So those tags contain their identifiers. So we call them accession numbers. So each object that comes into our collection, it receives a number. And so that way it can be identified and tracked within our system.
And so Kim actually has purple gloves on right now because she brought with her a few of our artifacts from the monuments collection. So we're just going to have Kim grab her favorite one, whichever one she wants to talk about. And look, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so we can zoom in and see it. And so whichever
I brought a few, so let's just say, don't put me on the spot, my favorite. No favorites here. How about we'll start with the dog tags, since I have an assistant here who's helping me.
All right, so I'm going to zoom in so you can see it there. And Robert, if you want to jump in at all and talk about this as well.
So this is a dog tag here from Dale Ford, Monuments Man. And, all soldiers and those in service received these dog tags so they could be identified. It contains their name. It's stamped with their names. But it's an identification tag. Robert, do you want to share how? Anything?
Well, Dale Ford was one of the monuments men who, at the end of the war, went into these salt mines and was responsible for identifying works of art that have been placed there for safekeeping from German museums. And he stayed in Germany for almost 2 years, helping evacuate these museum works out of the mines to get them back into the German museums as they were rebuilt. He was just one of probably 36 monuments men and women that we have known in the course of our work over the last 20 years, whose families donated to the Monuments Men Foundation their collections and personal artifacts. Sometimes they were original drawings like those you've seen of Dean Keller. Sometimes they were dog tags, personal journals, and you'll see some other examples of those things, some of their medals. And that collection now resides at the National World War II Museum alongside so many of their other compatriots' collections. And it's the greatest collection in the world on not only on World War II, but certainly on the monuments men and their great achievements during the war.
And speaking of one of those journals, Kim has in her hand, I'm going to zoom back in again, one of them.
So, Robert, I know you have a story that you shared about this particular piece. So this is a journal.
If you turn that thing sideways where we can see the spine of it, everyone can probably see there's a little bit of a curve there. And this was it's a moleskin notebook. You can go out to the store and buy them today, just like you could 70 years ago. And Walker Hancock, who was, as I mentioned earlier, one of the great sculptors in our country, carried that with him and made notes every day about things that he saw. He carried it in his in the pocket of his, in one of his leg pockets, and you can see where the moleskin's bent, where it shapes over the quadricep of his leg. So these are the fascinating elements of having these documents. You can actually see how they lived with him every day. And the page which she's got open is showing you a diagram which he made of one of the salt mines that he entered that contained about 200 hugely important paintings and other works of art. But the great shock was there were also 4 coffins inside this mine. And when they first discovered it, they were convinced that one of the coffins belonged to Adolf Hitler. That turned out to be wrong. They were the past German leaders whose bodies had been exhumed from where they'd been buried and placed inside this mine like a shrine. And they were convinced that this was an effort on the part of the Nazi regime to preserve these figures and have a day that perhaps they survived the war, they would retrieve them.
All right. And the last 2 artifacts that we are going to look at today are actually medals from one of the Monuments Men that we talked about. Of the Monuments Men, there were 2 killed, and one of them had the nickname Hutch, I believe. And so, Kim, I'll zoom in again. We have a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with us. So we'll start with the Purple Heart.
Sure. So these objects here are really, you know, they exemplify, they are examples of the risk that the Monuments Men undertook. So they were serving in Europe, you know, when victory wasn't yet secure. So it was still quite dangerous to be in some of the areas. And so these are the medals of Hutch, Walter Hutchausen. This is the Purple Heart. So Purple Hearts were awarded to those who were wounded in action, and sometimes, and Purple Hearts were also given to those who were killed in action, so the families of those who were killed in action. And then, so we have 2 medals. The Monuments Men collection contains 2 medals from Hutch, who you met earlier. And this is the Bronze Star. So that's for heroic action during the war. And you can see it's
Hutchausen actually received 2 Purple Hearts because when he arrived in England in May, June of 1944, shortly before the landings in France, he was severely injured by German bombs, the German bombing of London. And he had to go to a hospital, and that's one of the reasons which I describe in my book, that he didn't end up in service as a monuments officer until December 1944, because he was recovering from his serious wounds from the bombing in London. So he received a Purple Heart then, and then of course in April 1945, just a month before the war was over, none of the soldiers, of course, wanted to be killed, but everybody was trying to avoid being that last casualty. They knew the war was going to end soon. Everyone was looking forward to just getting back to their families. And there was a report of looted art that Hutchausen and another monuments officer, Sheldon Keck, went to check on, and they found themselves behind enemy lines, and a German machine gunner in a nest fired at their vehicle, and Keck survived. Hutchausen was killed. And it was one of the great losses to the Monuments Men to have 2 of their small group killed within a 30-day period. And it's really a miracle more weren't killed. Dean Keller in Italy was constantly going through booby-trapped buildings that the Nazis had not only destroyed cultural objects and destroyed buildings, but had left behind piano wires with bombs attached to them that they knew citizens would come and open doors. Sometimes it happened with kids. They would have musical instruments that they knew would be an attraction to a soldier walking by, that they would put a hand grenade underneath. So there difficult stories to read about, but they're part of the war.
All right. And to make sure that the Monuments Men are never forgotten and that their story is not forgotten, the National World War II Museum in our Liberation Pavilion will be housing this entire collection and showing it. And so before we move to questions, are going to let Kim just quickly talk about what that collection is going to look like in our Liberation Pavilion.
Sure, and Robert, jump in here if you would like as well. So in our Liberation Pavilion, which is slated to open in 2021, so we have a couple years still to work on it, but we're already beginning to design this building and the exhibits inside the building, and also talk about the objects that will be placed in the building and the stories. So the Monuments Men story will be told in the Liberation Pavilion, which the Liberation Pavilion mainly tells the story of the end of the war and the after effects of World War II. And the Monuments Men story, certainly Robert talked about how some of the Monuments Men, it's still an ongoing story, right? It's going on today still, but certainly in the years after the war, there were a lot of mysteries and a lot of puzzles still to be figured out. So those stories will all be told in this gallery. It's very environmental, so you can see the slide that you're seeing now replicates a salt mine. So you'll see some of the artwork. So it looks like you're coming onto the scene, similar to what some of the Monuments Men discovered. So the treasures in place as they were hidden by the Nazis.
Right. Well, thank you, Kim.
The whole idea is recreating the salt mine and trying to have the visitors, come to the museum and walk through and get a sense of the excitement, exhilaration, and terror the monuments officers felt going into these dark spaces, not knowing whether they were booby-trapped, whether the works of art they would find were just fragments because they'd been destroyed by the Nazis, or whether they were in fact intact. And it's an exciting way to share this story. It's going to have a lot of the personal interviews that I've conducted with the Monuments Men over the course of time and Monuments Women. And we're really, really excited about it.
All right.
Yeah, agreed. So stay tuned for that coming soon in the next couple of years here at the museum.
And thank you, Kim, for joining us. It's always nice to have a curator kind of give their take on things. And we are now going to turn it over to questions. So teachers, if your students have questions, or anyone watching, if you look to that Q&A, we already have a couple here that have come in. Go ahead and type them in. Also, if you would like to put your name or the student's name, feel free to do that as well. And Robert, we're going to start with our first question. And it's from Anne, and she's wondering how much missing artwork still exists today.
Well, there are hundreds of thousands of works of art that are missing from World War II. Practically every week, something surfaces somewhere in the world. The Monuments Men Foundation has found and returned more than 30 objects over the last 15 years. The foundation, which I created in 2007, works with a lot of soldiers' families that brought things back without understanding their cultural importance. They weren't supposed to be brought back, but we identify who the rightful owners are and return them. But there are works of art all over the world, wherever soldiers or displaced persons from these countries lived. Sometimes they were looted, sometimes they were taken as souvenirs. But it's ongoing. It's really kind of the unwritten chapter of this remarkable portion of World War II, the final chapter, to track down these missing works of art and get them back where they belong.
And if you go right to the Monuments Men website, can you see any of those works of art that they're still looking for?
You can. If you visit the Monuments Men Foundation website, monumentsmenfoundation.org, we have photographs of works of art that we found and returned. Some of the return ceremonies, which have been quite celebratory. We have works of art that are on our most wanted list that we continue to look for, and they're hugely important artists, Vincent van Gogh, Rembrandt, and others. And we have announcements from time to time about the works of art that we've found and that are on their way back home.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to move away from World War II history for a second. And I have a question from Michael from Caribou Middle School. And this was, at what age did you start writing, and really what inspired you?
Well, my writing of the first book was published in 2006, Rescuing Da Vinci, which is a more photographic telling of the story. And at the time I was 40 years old. I have been writing since I was young, but not with ambitions of writing a book. I will tell you a funny story. When I was 9 or 10, my younger brother and I went into the dining room of our house, and we had this big box of pencils, and my mother and father came in and said, "What are you all doing?" And we said, "Well, we're going to write a book." And they said, "What are you going to write about?" And we looked at each other and sat there for about 15 minutes and realized we didn't have a clue what we were going to write about. But I guess my interest about writing did have some origins back to those early days. And in the 1990s, I was living in Florence, and I wondered, purely out of curiosity, how so many works of art survived the most destructive war in history, and who were the people that saved them. And it was a question that seemed like it would have an easy answer, but there wasn't an easy answer. And the more I dug into it, the more fascinated I was. And that curiosity took me on this journey that's now been underway for 20 years and has led me to meet 20 different monuments men and women, 17 men, interview them, their family members, travel to these museums and salt mines, and write these 4 books, motivated by sharing what I think is one of the most exciting stories you'll ever hear, and one of the most uplifting and noble stories about what difference one person can make.
Awesome. And so St. Anthony's School, going back to World War II and the pieces of art, want to know, what is the most expensive piece of art that was recovered?
Well, you saw the photograph of the Ghent Altarpiece, which George Stout was struggling to figure out how to put it back into a crate. I mean, while George Stout had the idea of creating these cultural preservation officers and envisioned that there was going to be some amount of looting, no one, even him, imagined that there would be looting to this extent and of such hugely important paintings. And I'm sure he was sitting there thinking, this very experienced conservator of works of art inside this freezing cold salt mine, what the heck do you do when you have a painting that was painted in 1432 by a painter that was as important as Leonardo, Jan van Eyck? How do you begin to crate that thing up and get it out safely? I mean, what do you do in those kinds of conditions? So the textbook was being written as they were doing the work, and that painting, if it could ever come onto the market, would be $1 billion painting, perhaps more. I mean, these works of art that we're talking about are so rare and so important that with the number of billionaires there are in the world today, they would be a conquest, a trophy for anyone to have, and because no one else in the world could have it.
Awesome. We've actually had 2 people ask this question. So Molly asks, did Japan loot art, and were there monuments men in the Pacific Theater?
Molly, great questions. There were monuments officers in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese did loot, along with all the other horrible things that they did. The monuments officers' success in Europe was that they were on the ground doing work while the battle was ongoing, and as territory was being liberated, they were into these areas to effect temporary repairs and then begin the treasure hunt, trying to find what was stolen. As you probably know, in Japan, we did not have soldiers on the ground on the main island of Japan until after the second atomic bomb was dropped. And so the war had come to an end then. So the effort to try and protect cultural treasures from damage of war was a moot point. There were only about a dozen or so of them. More than half were British, because these areas of Malaysia and Southeast Asia that had been British territorial possessions, many of the British had more familiarity with the areas. but there were a number of important monuments men in Japan, in Tokyo, none more important than George Stout. Stout not only came up with the idea and went to war in Europe, but after the main discoveries were made, he was pretty fed up and tired. He'd taken 1 day of vacation in 2 years, 1 day of vacation in 2 years. And he wanted to go back to his family, but he wasn't home more than a month before he decided we need to have an operation like this in Japan, and he knew the most about it. So off to Japan he went, and he helped get the office set up in Tokyo.
Awesome. And so we have time for about one more question. And so Artie wanted to know, we've talked a lot about the works that have been recovered or still missing, but what are some of the famous pieces that were destroyed or damaged that we know of?
Another great question. Well, they're probably the greatest loss in the history of art took place in Berlin in days after the war was over, sadly. That makes it even more of a tragedy. The Soviet Red Army was in control of Berlin. There was a hugely a significant flak tower, this concrete bunker that was about 12 stories high with walls that were about 9 foot thick of concrete. You could park a tank in front of the wall and fire at it, and the tank round would bounce off the wall. And inside these buildings, which could house 30,000 people, the German museum directors had placed some of the most important works of art from the museums in Berlin that were too large to put on trucks and take to hide in the salt mines. In the days after the war ended, there were people wandering the streets, trying to avoid being killed, looking for food, trying to stay warm. And the Soviet Red Army forces were aware that these works of art were inside one of these flak towers, and they were supposed to be safeguarding it, but they really weren't paying attention, and a fire started. No one knows for certain whether it was a deliberate fire to cover up a theft, whether it was an accident, someone just trying to stay warm and dropped a match on the ground. But some 450 paintings by painters like Caravaggio, Rubens, Rembrandt, Botticelli, the most important painters in the world, went up in flames. We know that, contrary to the thoughts for some 60 years, a few of the paintings survived, but they're the smaller pictures that someone could carry or hide under their jacket and walk out with. But these pictures I'm speaking of were paintings that were large format pictures, about the size of that painting you saw Dean Keller standing next to. And they were just incinerated in this extremely, extremely devastating fire.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for sharing your book and sharing your knowledge of the Monuments Men. Again, I'm going to share my screen. If you don't have the book already, you can go to our museum store. You just go to our website and click the store button, and you type in The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History or Robert Edsel. You will see this book pop up, and at checkout, if you use the code webinar, then you will receive a 20% discount. And we just want to thank you all for taking your time on a Tuesday to spend with the National World War II Museum and Distance Learning Studio. And Robert, I'll leave the last word to you. Thank you again.
Well, thanks to everybody for being with us. It's a great story. I hope you'll enjoy it and realize that all of these works of art belong to everybody, and they haven't survived by accident. People that came before us wanted to make sure that we had a chance to see them, and the responsibility for protecting them for your generation and future generations will someday soon rest in your hands. So I hope you'll enjoy this story, and I hope you'll be inspired by the actions of these remarkably brave men and women who did this great thing that benefits all of us today.
All right. Thanks, guys, and have a great day. We hope you read the book.